Welcome to a journey through the dramatic saga of the Soviet Union, a story spanning from fiery revolution in 1917 to its peaceful collapse in 1991. In this roughly one-hour narrative, we'll explore how a revolutionary ideal transformed into a global superpower and then unraveled. The tale unfolds chronologically, from the tumult of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, through the eras of Lenin and Stalin, the crucible of World War II, and the tense decades of the Cold War, to the reforms of Gorbachev and the final dissolution of the USSR. Along the way, we'll pause for thematic asides to illuminate the Soviet economy, culture, and the nuclear arms race that defined an era. This is a story of utopian dreams and harsh realities, of terror and triumph, of war and peace. Let's begin in Petrograd, 1917, where the old world is about to be swept away by revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917. In the midst of World War I, Imperial Russia was teetering on the brink. Years of corruption, hardship, and military failures had eroded faith in the Tsar. In February 1917, mass protests and mutinies forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending centuries of Romanov rule. A provisional government of liberals and moderate socialists took charge, but struggled to address the people's demands for peace, land, and bread. Into this volatile mix stepped the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist faction led by Vladimir Lenin. On the night of October 25, 1917, old-style calendar, Lenin and the Bolsheviks launched an armed insurrection in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Red Guard soldiers and armed workers, inspired by Lenin's fiery speeches and promises, seized government buildings and stormed the Winter Palace, arresting the provisional officials. By the next day, the Bolsheviks had effectively seized power in the capital, toppling the provisional government. This bold coup, later glorified as the October Revolution, shocked the world and marked the birth of a new political order. Lenin proclaimed a socialist government of workers and peasants, immediately moving to pull Russia out of the World War and to redistribute land to the peasantry. However, the Bolshevik rise was not unopposed, and the fledgling regime would soon face a brutal fight for survival. The Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1921. No sooner had the Bolsheviks taken power than Russia descended into a bloody civil war. On one side were Lenin's Bolshevik Red Army, fighting to defend the revolution. On the other, a fractured array of white forces, monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and others opposed to Bolshevik rule, along with various regional warlords and foreign armies from the Allied powers who intervened, fearing Bolshevism as a new threat. The conflict was merciless. Battle lines surged back and forth across the former empire's vastness, from the Ukrainian steppe to Siberia. Whole cities changed hands multiple times. The Bolsheviks, guided by Leon Trotsky's organizational genius and propelled by ideological zeal, gradually gained the upper hand. They controlled the core central territories and industrial centers, allowing them to equip and feed their armies, while the whites remained divided in leadership and purpose. By 1920, the Red Army had defeated most white armies and foreign expeditions. In 1921, the last significant white forces in Crimea were crushed, effectively ending the Civil War. The Bolshevik victory came at a horrific cost. Perhaps 7 to 12 million people perished from combat, famine, and disease. In the process, the old order was extinguished. The Bolsheviks not only vanquished their enemies, but also brutally eliminated the last Romanov Tsar and his family, who were executed in 1918 to prevent them from becoming rallying symbols for the whites. By the end of 1922, Lenin and his comrades stood triumphant amid smoldering ruins, ready to build a new socialist state from the ashes of a collapsed empire. Lenin's leadership and the birth of the USSR, 1921 to 1924. With the Civil War won, Lenin faced the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered nation. He moved swiftly to consolidate Bolshevik rule across the former imperial territories. In 1922, a treaty was signed uniting Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics into a new federal state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. This was the formal birth of the Soviet Union, a communist state that aspired to unite numerous peoples under the banner of Marxism-Leninism. Lenin established the capital in Moscow and set up a one-party dictatorship under the Communist Party, Bolshevik. However, the early 1920s brought immense hardships. War and revolution had wrecked the economy. Factories lay idle and farmlands ruined. In 1921, a devastating famine swept through parts of Russia and Ukraine. To revive production, Lenin made a strategic retreat from pure communist economics and introduced the New Economic Policy, NEP. The New Economic Policy allowed a bit of private trade and small-scale private farming, injecting limited market incentives into the socialist economy. This policy helped stabilize food supply and brought a measure of recovery. Meanwhile, Lenin's government created the Cheka, secret police, and used red terror tactics to quash remaining opposition. The arts and education were harnessed for propaganda, yet also experienced a brief flourish of avant-garde creativity under the more liberal climate of the 1920s. Lenin did not live long to see his socialist vision fully realized. His health deteriorated after surviving an assassination attempt and suffering strokes. On January 21, 1924, Vladimir Lenin died at age 53. His death plunged the Soviet leadership into a succession struggle. But for the moment, Lenin was enshrined as a revolutionary icon, his body embalmed in a Red Square mausoleum, and cities and streets across the country renamed in his honor. Under Lenin's leadership, the USSR had been founded and its post-war chaos stabilized, but great challenges and power struggles lay ahead as the reins passed to a new generation of leaders. Stalin's Rise and the Great Terror, 1924 to 1939. After Lenin's death, a fierce power struggle ensued in the Kremlin. The two main contenders were Leon Trotsky, a brilliant orator and organizer who had led the Red Army, and Joseph Stalin, the party's general secretary known for his political cunning. Though Lenin had harbored doubts about Stalin and even warned of his ruthlessness, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals in the 1920s. Trotsky was isolated, expelled from the Communist Party, and ultimately exiled from the USSR in 1929. By the end of the decade, Stalin had consolidated dictatorial power. Stalin now unleashed a radical transformation of Soviet society. He introduced a series of 5-year plans to force rapid industrialization. Giant steel mills, dams, and factories rose at breakneck speed, turning a peasant nation into an industrial power. The human cost was enormous. Workers toiled long hours under harsh conditions, and failure to meet quotas could be punished as treason. Simultaneously, Stalin's regime forcibly collectivized agriculture. Individual peasant farms were combined into large state-run collectives. Peasants who resisted, pejoratively labeled kulaks, were deported or executed. The upheaval in the countryside led to catastrophic famine, notably the Holodomor in Ukraine, 1932 to 33, where millions starved to death. These brutal measures did achieve industrial growth. By the late 1930s, the USSR's heavy industry output had surged: coal, steel, armaments, but at the cost of millions of lives lost to famine and labor camps. By the mid-1930s, Stalin had built a personal cult of personality and concentrated all authority in himself. Paranoia and desire for total control drove him to launch the Great Purge, 1936 to 1938. A campaign of terror to eliminate any perceived enemies of the people or challengers within the Communist Party. During this period, mass arrests, show trials, and executions became routine. Top Bolshevik veterans, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, and even former secret police chiefs, were accused of treason in staged trials and then shot, often after giving forced confessions. The purges decimated the Red Army's officer corps as well. Tens of thousands of military officers, some 34,000 by one count, were arrested, exiled, or executed, leaving the Soviet armed forces weakened. According to NKVD secret police records, roughly 681,000 people were shot in just 1937 to 38, and hundreds of thousands more perished in the Gulag labor camps during the Purge era. Scholars estimate total deaths in the Great Purge around 700,000 to 1.2 million. Ordinary citizens, too, lived in fear. A denounced word or old association could send one to a prison cell in the dead of night. Stalin's reign of terror secured his absolute dominance and crushed any dissent, but it also robbed the USSR of many of its most skilled minds and loyal citizens. By 1939, the Soviet Union had been brutally reshaped. A modernized industrial economy under rigid state control, a cowed society where Stalin's word was law, and a military and bureaucracy purged of all but the most compliant. World War II. The Great Patriotic War, 1939 to 1945. In September 1939, World War II erupted in Europe, and the Soviet Union was first an uneasy partner of Nazi Germany. Stalin had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler, a non-aggression treaty, and together they carved up Poland. But this pact was merely a prelude to an even greater conflict. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. In the early hours of that day, without warning, over 3 million Axis troops stormed across the border. The Nazi onslaught caught the Red Army off guard and inflicted devastating losses in the initial months. By autumn 1941, German armies had surged deep into Soviet territory, laying siege to Leningrad and reaching the outskirts of Moscow. The USSR was in mortal peril. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Under Stalin's grim leadership, the nation mustered an incredible war effort. Factories in Western Russia were dismantled and shipped east beyond the Ural Mountains, out of enemy reach, where they churned out tanks and planes. Soviet citizens fought with unmatched tenacity, fueled by patriotism and the brutal knowledge that Nazi occupiers were slaughtering civilians. The tide began to turn in the freezing winter of 1941 to 42, when the German advance stalled at the gates of Moscow. Then came Stalingrad. From late 1942 into early 1943, the city of Stalingrad, Volgograd, on the Volga, became the site of a titanic battle. Soviet forces, at unimaginable cost, encircled and defeated the German Sixth Army there. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in February 1943 with the surrender of the German army, a crushing defeat for Hitler's forces. This proved a decisive turning point. Thereafter, the Red Army gained momentum and began pushing the invaders westward. Over 1943 to 1945, the Soviet Great Patriotic War, as World War II is known in Russia, saw epic Soviet victories. Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, and the long, bloody advance through Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and Poland toward Germany. In April 1945, Soviet troops encircled Berlin. Fierce street-by-street combat raged in the German capital. Finally, on May 2, 1945, the Red Army captured Berlin, and a few days later, Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. In a symbolic moment, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, signifying the end of the war in Europe. Victory came at an almost unimaginable cost. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of World War II's human toll. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens perished in the war. Roughly 1 out of every 3 WFU deaths was a citizen of the USSR. Cities from Stalingrad to Kiev lay in ruins, and thousands of villages had been wiped off the map. Nonetheless, the USSR emerged from World War II as a global superpower, with its armies occupying Eastern Europe all the way to the heart of Germany. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill had been uneasy allies during the war, meeting in conferences at Tehran and Yalta to shape the post-war world. But with the common Nazi enemy defeated, old suspicions resurfaced quickly. The Soviet Union's wartime alliance with the Western powers was fleeting. Even as Soviets celebrated victory in 1945, a new rivalry with the West was brewing. The Cold War was about to begin. The Cold War and the Division of Europe, 1945 to 1953. In the aftermath of World War II, the world's geopolitical landscape split into two hostile camps. The Soviet Union, having liberated and subsequently occupied Eastern Europe, installed pro-Soviet communist governments throughout the region. From Poland and East Germany to Bulgaria and beyond, an Eastern Bloc under Moscow's influence took shape. In response, the United States and Western European nations forged their own alliance, NATO, in 1949, and supported non-communist regimes in Western Europe. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously declared an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing East from West. This was the dawn of the Cold War, an era of intense ideological and political rivalry between the capitalist West and the communist East. Stalin's Soviet Union moved quickly to consolidate its new sphere. In 1948, when the Western Allies merged their zones of occupied Germany to form West Germany, Stalin retaliated by blockading West Berlin, an enclave deep inside the Soviet zone. The Western powers answered with the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 49, flying in supplies to sustain the city, a high-stakes confrontation that ended with Stalin lifting the blockade. In 1949, the Cold War's stakes skyrocketed when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, years ahead of American predictions. The U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons was broken, and the nuclear arms race had begun. On the global stage, former allies became adversaries. Stalin regarded the West with deep mistrust, and the West feared the spread of communism. By 1950, the Cold War turned hot on the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet-backed North Korean invasion of South Korea led to the Korean War, pitting communist and UN, mostly American forces against each other. Though the war ended in stalemate in 1953, it underscored the new bipolar world order. Inside the USSR, the late Stalin years were marked by continued repression and a grim conformity. The Cold War era had begun in earnest, a time defined by espionage, propaganda battles, and the constant shadow of nuclear annihilation. When Stalin died in March 1953, the Soviet Union was a nuclear-armed superpower and controlled an empire of satellite states. But its people remained isolated behind the Iron Curtain, and a climate of fear lingered from the years of terror. Khrushchev's thaw and high Cold War, 1953 to 1964. Stalin's death set off a scramble among Soviet leaders. After a brief interregnum and the fall of secret police chief Beria, Nikita Khrushchev emerged on top by late 1955. Khrushchev soon took the USSR in surprising new directions. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, he delivered a bombshell secret speech denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and crimes. This sparked a thaw in domestic life. Censorship was relaxed slightly. Millions of Gulag prisoners were rehabilitated, and a sense of hope flickered among intellectuals. However, when subject peoples in the Eastern Bloc tried to push the boundaries of this freedom, such as the Hungarian uprising of 1956, Khrushchev showed the limits of his tolerance by sending in Soviet tanks to crush dissent. Internationally, the Cold War reached some of its most perilous moments under Khrushchev's watch. In 1961, tensions flared in Germany. East Germany, backed by Moscow, erected the Berlin Wall to stop the flood of refugees to the west. That same year, the world watched the space race take off. The Soviet Union stunned everyone by launching the first human into space. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in April 1961, a triumphant demonstration of Soviet technology. This achievement followed the USSR's launch of Sputnik, the first satellite, in 1957, and made the Soviet Union appear ascendant in science and exploration. But Cold War competition was fiercest in the realm of nuclear arms and geopolitics. In 1962, the rivalry nearly ignited World War III during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev's secret deployment of nuclear missiles to communist Cuba prompted a showdown with U.S. President John F. Kennedy. For 13 agonizing days in October 1962, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war as U.S. naval forces blockaded Cuba. At last, diplomacy prevailed. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for U.S. assurances not to invade Cuba, and a secret withdrawal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis, which observers believe brought the superpowers closest to nuclear conflict, ended with both sides shaken by the specter of mutual destruction. A direct hotline communication link was soon established between Washington and Moscow to manage future emergencies. Khrushchev's personality was bold and brash, famous for banging his shoe on a UN podium and issuing boisterous challenges to the West. But by 1964, his colleagues had grown wary of his erratic leadership. Economic growth was uneven. Some of his agricultural experiments, like the Virgin Lands campaign, faltered, and the Cuban Missile fiasco was seen by insiders as a blunder. In October 1964, the party leadership ousted Khrushchev in a quiet coup. He was forced into retirement, replaced by a collective leadership headed by Leonid Brezhnev. Khrushchev's era had thawed the worst of Stalinist terror and scored landmark achievements, from spaceflight to improving relations temporarily with the West. But it also saw high-risk confrontations. The Soviet Union remained a superpower locked in a global Cold War, now armed with even more powerful nuclear weapons than before. The nuclear arms race and MAD. While political winds shifted under different Soviet leaders, one constant throughout the Cold War was the arms race, a relentless buildup of nuclear arsenals by both the USSR and the USA. In the late 1940s, the US had sole possession of atomic bombs. But by 1949, the Soviets had the bomb, and by 1953, both sides tested vastly more powerful hydrogen bombs. An existential standoff took shape. Each superpower raced to outdo the other in number and destructive power of nuclear weapons. The logic of the arms race was grim but seemingly unavoidable. Both feared that any lag might invite aggression from the other. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the USSR and USA poured national treasure into producing missiles, bombers, and submarines capable of delivering nuclear warheads across the globe. By the late 1960s, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, was firmly in place. Each side had amassed enough nuclear firepower to annihilate the other, and likely all human civilization, in retaliation for any first strike. A fearful balance emerged. Neither side could risk using these weapons without suffering ruinous reprisal. This balance of terror paradoxically kept an uneasy peace. Still, the sheer scale of arms buildup was staggering. The Soviets developed intercontinental ballistic missiles ICBMs and fielded huge conventional forces in Europe, while the Americans ringed the USSR with bases and missiles. Both sides also embraced the space race as an extension of the arms competition, launching spy satellites and aiming to demonstrate technological superiority, as seen in feats like Sputnik and the Apollo moon landing. By the 1980s, the arms race had reached its climax. The Soviet nuclear stockpile swelled to monstrous size. The USSR possessed on the order of 35,000 to 40,000 nuclear warheads by the mid-1980s, roughly matching and eventually slightly exceeding the US arsenal. Together, the superpowers held over 60,000 nuclear weapons capable of destroying the world many times over. This frenetic buildup included multiple warhead missiles, ever quicker launch systems, and plans for space-based defenses, like the US Star Wars initiative. Children in both America and the Soviet Union grew up under the shadow of the mushroom cloud, with duck and cover drills in the US and civil defense training in the USSR. The arms race drained economic resources and raised international anxiety, but it also spurred periods of diplomacy. In the 1970s, Both sides signed arms control treaties, the SALT Accords, to put some limits on strategic weapons. Yet the competition only truly eased in the late 1980s, when economic strain and enlightened leadership opened the door to major agreements. Until then, the arms race was a central drama of the Cold War, a deadly sword of Damocles hanging over the world for decades. Brezhnev era and stagnation, 1964 to 1982. After Khrushchev's removal, Leonid Brezhnev became the Soviet Union's dominant leader, holding power from 1964 until his death in 1982. The Brezhnev era is remembered for a mix of stability and stagnation. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the USSR reached the zenith of its global power and influence. The Soviet military was strong. The country had achieved nuclear parity with the United States, recognized in the 1972 Salt-Wine Treaty. And Soviet prestige was high after feats like putting the first man in space. Brezhnev pursued a policy of détente with the West from 1969 onward, a temporary easing of Cold War tensions. He met with US presidents, signing arms control agreements and even expanding trade. Meanwhile, in 1975, Soviet cosmonauts and American astronauts shook hands in orbit during the Apollo-Soyuz joint space mission, a hopeful symbol of cooperation. Yet Brezhnev's rule also saw the era of stagnation. By the mid-1970s, the initial optimism had faded. The Soviet economy, while a formidable industrial machine, began to falter. There was perceptible improvement in living standards in the 1960s, but then stagnation or decline set in by the 1970s. Factories were antiquated, agriculture struggled, despite heavy investments, and technological innovation lagged behind the West. Central planning bureaucrats focused on meeting plan quotas in quantity, often at the expense of quality. Shortages of consumer goods became chronic. It was common for Soviet citizens to stand in long lines for basic items like meat or shoes. A thriving black market emerged to fill the gaps of the planned economy, and corruption seeped through the system from top to bottom. Politically, Brezhnev's regime grew increasingly repressive after the relative thaw under Khrushchev. The state clamped down on free expression and dissent. Censorship was tightened, and those who dared criticize the system were harassed or imprisoned. Notably, writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who exposed the horrors of the Gulag in his works, was expelled from the USSR in 1974 after years of persecution. Other dissidents, like Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist turned human rights advocate, were silenced or exiled internally. Yet a counterculture bloomed in hidden corners. Clandestine copies of banned books, samizdat literature circulated. Western rock music albums and movies were smuggled on tapes, and an underground intellectual life simmered beneath the facade of official conformity. The KGB kept close watch, but could not extinguish the desire for freer expression. Brezhnev was a staunch believer in Soviet superpower status. Under his doctrine, later dubbed the Brezhnev Doctrine, Moscow asserted the right to intervene if socialism in any Allied country was threatened. This policy was brutally demonstrated in 1968 when Warsaw Pact troops, led by the USSR, invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring reforms. A more fateful intervention came at the end of the 1970s. In December 1979, Brezhnev ordered the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Aiming to prop up a faltering communist government in Kabul, the USSR found itself mired in a guerrilla war against determined Afghan fighters, the Mujahideen, armed in part by the West. The Afghan war became a bloody quagmire, often likened to Russia's Vietnam, costing thousands of young Soviet lives and draining resources. It also ended the period of détente. Relations with the West soured as the US boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics in protest, and a new arms buildup ensued with the vehemently anti-Soviet US President Ronald Reagan taking office in 1981. By the time Brezhnev died in November 1982, the Soviet Union was stagnating on multiple fronts. The economy was barely growing. In the late 1970s, growth in industry and agriculture had slowed to a crawl. Living standards for ordinary people had stagnated or worsened. Medical care and services were in decline. And the war in Afghanistan and high defense spending strained the state's finances. The once inspirational communist ideology felt ossified. The USSR still projected the image of a superpower, with a massive military and extensive global influence. But beneath that surface, cracks were widening. In the halls of the Kremlin, two brief successors, Yuri Andropov, 1982 to 84, and Konstantin Chernenko, 1984 to 85, both elderly and in poor health, tried in vain to rejuvenate the system. Andropov, a former KGB chief, did initiate some anti-corruption campaigns and hinted at reform, but died after only 15 months. Chernenko, too, lasted just a year before succumbing to illness. By 1985, the Soviet leadership was literally dying of old age. The stage was set for a new generation and new ideas to try to save the USSR from terminal decline. Soviet society, economy, and culture in the late USSR, an aside. For ordinary Soviet citizens, life in the 1960s to 1980s was a study in contrasts, marked by social achievements and cultural pride on one hand, but daily frustrations and repressions on the other. The Soviet Union touted free education, universal health care, and full employment as proud successes of its socialist system. Indeed, literacy rates soared, and by the Brezhnev years, a generation had grown up in a world of space triumphs, like Gagarin's flight, and sports glories, the USSR's dominance in Olympic competitions and chess championships. Science and engineering were highly esteemed. Soviet citizens took pride in being one of two superpowers. A sense of communal solidarity was part of life. Many urban dwellers lived in crowded communal apartments or in massive prefabricated housing blocks, the Panelak high-rises, where multiple families might share kitchens and corridors. Daily life was modest. Most families had basic appliances, perhaps a black and white TV, color TVs by the 80s, and a tiny car like a Lada if they were lucky, often after years on a waiting list. Yet under the veneer of stability, the planned economy often failed to deliver quality consumer goods and variety. By the 1970s, it became almost a cliché that Soviet shoppers routinely encountered empty store shelves for anything beyond the basics. When a shipment of fresh meat or oranges arrived, long queues would instantly form, winding down city blocks. People learned to make do with what was available, barter informally, or rely on the black market for coveted Western products, jeans, tape recorders, cosmetics. The shadow economy grew, breeding petty corruption. Favors and bribes, BLAT, were often needed to obtain apartments, car parts, or better hospital treatment. Despite these hardships, essentials like bread were subsidized and cheap, and most citizens had a job, even if sometimes it was underproductive work. Life in the late Soviet Union was generally safe and routine, if somewhat drab. Many recall the era with nostalgia for its predictability. We pretended to work, and they pretended to pay us, went a wry joke, but also acknowledged the lack of freedoms and consumer comforts. Culturally, the regime promoted a rosy, idealized socialist culture. Socialist realism in art and literature praised workers and patriotic heroes. Popular culture had its state-sanctioned stars, barred singers with poetic lyrics, carefully censored movies, and ubiquitous propaganda images of happy factory workers. But beneath official culture, a rich unofficial culture thrived. People eagerly consumed whatever scraps of foreign culture they could get. Western music, from rock to jazz, circulated on bootleg cassette tapes and even on X-ray films smuggled as vinyl records. Blue jeans were a prized possession for fashion-conscious Soviet youths. In the privacy of kitchens, known as kitchen table talks, friends would discuss forbidden books or critique the government in hushed tones. Meanwhile, the state security organs kept watch. The KGB infiltrated dissident circles and ensured that open opposition remained rare and dangerous. Notable dissidents, such as Nobel laureate Andrei Sakharov, who advocated for human rights and disarmament, were surveilled and exiled internally. Sakharov spent years in closed city Gorky for his outspokenness. Religion, too, though officially suppressed, quietly persisted. Especially in rural areas and among older generations, people continued to attend Orthodox churches or mosques, albeit carefully. The government's atheism softened somewhat by the 1980s, but public religious expression was still limited. Minority ethnic cultures also navigated between Soviet homogenization and local traditions. The USSR was a multi-ethnic empire, and while Russian language and culture dominated official life, diverse languages, from Baltic to Central Asian, survived, often flourishing in private and within minority republics. In summary, Soviet society provided a mix of security and stagnation. Citizens benefited from some social guarantees, no fear of unemployment or medical bills, but they also sacrificed personal freedoms and consumer prosperity. By the time a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took charge in 1985, many Soviet people were yearning for change. Whether that meant economic betterment, freedom to travel and speak openly, or simply more variety on store shelves. The stage was set for a dramatic attempt to reform the system from within. Gorbachev's reforms. Glasnost and Perestroika, 1985 to 1991. In March 1985, the Politburo chose Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary, a momentous choice. At 54, Gorbachev was a generation younger than his predecessors and brimmed with ideas to rescue the flailing system. He soon introduced two watchwords that would define the era: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika aimed to reform the stagnant Soviet economy, allowing a measure of market mechanisms, decentralizing control and encouraging efficiency. Small cooperatives, quasi-private businesses, were legalized in services and retail. Managers got more leeway in running factories. But economic reform was slow and often incoherent. Vested interests in the bureaucracy resisted change, and partial reforms sometimes worsened shortages. Glasnost, however, had an immediate and electrifying impact. From about 1987 onward, Gorbachev urged an unprecedented open discussion of societal problems. The censorship that had cloaked Soviet life in silence for decades began to lift. The media published revelations about previously taboo subjects: the Stalinist purges, the Gulag camps, government corruption, the hidden severity of incidents like the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Soviet people experienced a heady gust of truth-telling. Newspapers suddenly debated policy, and long-banned works of literature and film became accessible. Citizens could speak more freely than ever before. Gorbachev famously declared, "We can't go on living like this," acknowledging the need for profound change. Politically, glasnost led to democratizing reforms. In 1989, the USSR held semi-free elections for a new Congress of People's Deputies. The first time real public debate echoed through the Kremlin's halls. Genuine opposition voices, like the radical Boris Yeltsin, were elected. The spectacle of legislative sessions televised live, where deputies openly criticized communist authorities, was astonishing to viewers. Meanwhile, Gorbachev also moved to ease Cold War tensions. He found a willing partner in US President Ronald Reagan. The two developed a respectful rapport and held a series of summits. In 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles. This was the first actual reduction, not just limitation, of nuclear arms, a major thaw in the arms race. Gorbachev also ordered the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan, finally ending that draining war in 1989. Most dramatically, Gorbachev chose not to use force to maintain Soviet control over the Eastern European satellite states. As glasnost spread, democratic movements swept through Eastern Europe in 1989. One by one, the communist regimes in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and more fell to popular, peaceful revolutions. Gorbachev's decision to loosen the Soviet yoke on Eastern Europe allowed these nations to break free. The iconic symbol of this change was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, as jubilant Germans from east and west tore down the barrier dividing their city. Unlike in 1956 or 1968, Soviet tanks stayed in their barracks. Gorbachev's restraint earned him global praise and later a Nobel Peace Prize, even as it unsettled hardliners at home who saw the Soviet Empire crumbling. Within the USSR, Glasnost had also awakened long-suppressed nationalist feelings among the non-Russian republics. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania led the way, demanding independence. In 1990, Lithuania declared independence outright. Similar sentiments rose in Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, and others. The Soviet Union was starting to crack from within as its diverse peoples questioned why they should remain tied to Moscow. By 1990 to 91, the USSR faced a dire economic crisis. Perestroika's half measures had not delivered prosperity. Instead, the economy spiraled into shortages and even rationing of some foods in cities. The Communist Party was fracturing between reformists and hardliners. Gorbachev tried to navigate a middle path, proposing a new union treaty to voluntarily reshape the USSR into a looser federation. But this alarmed the hardline communists in his government and the military. In August 1991, as Gorbachev vacationed in Crimea, hardliners staged a coup d'état attempt. They put Gorbachev under house arrest and declared a state of emergency to save the USSR. The plotters sent tanks into Moscow. But the Soviet public, now politicized and unafraid thanks to Glasnost, resisted. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, famously climbed atop a tank outside the parliament, the White House, and rallied crowds against the coup. The army units wavered, and the coup collapsed after 3 tense days. Gorbachev was freed, but his authority had evaporated. The real power had shifted to Yeltsin, who banned the Communist Party in Russia and seized Soviet government assets. One by one, the Union republics declared independence in those autumn months of 1991. Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and more. By December, it was clear the Union could not be saved. In early December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and agreed to dissolve the USSR, forming a loose commonwealth of independent states instead. Facing the inevitable, Gorbachev agreed to step down. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union, declaring the office extinct. That evening, the red flag with hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor flag. The Soviet Union, after 69 years of existence, ceased to exist. 15 independent republics emerged from its vast territory. It was a largely peaceful breakup, a remarkable historical moment where a superpower dissolved not with a bang of war, but with the whimper of a pen stroke and a televised farewell speech. People worldwide watched in amazement as the Cold War ended without the apocalypse so long feared, and a new era began for the former Soviet peoples. Epilogue. Thus ended the Soviet experiment, an empire born of revolution and ideology, which rose to mighty heights and then imploded under the weight of its contradictions. In its lifetime, the Soviet Union dramatically altered the course of the 20th century. It championed a vision of socialist society that inspired and threatened in equal measure. It played the decisive role in defeating Nazi fascism, and it engaged in a decades-long Cold War that defined an era. Its people endured extraordinary hardship and achieved remarkable feats. When it collapsed, the world's geopolitical order was transformed overnight. The end of the USSR gave hope for a new freedom and also ushered in uncertainty and turmoil for its former citizens. Today, the legacy of the Soviet Union remains deeply debated. A mix of pride in past achievements, memories of repression, and lessons about the complexity of building a just society. As we conclude this narrative, we leave you with that iconic final image of December 1991. A flag coming down in the Moscow twilight, marking not just the end of a state, but the end of an era in world history.